So ladies and gentlemen, if you can all take your seats, we are ready to start the next panel. A very good afternoon to you all. I hope you had a wonderful lunch. Welcome to our next panel, The Union Divided, Quo Vadis Europe, in which we will be discussing the future of the European Union and some of the challenges we face. My name is Csaba Tóth. I'm Director of Strategy at the Republikon Institute, which is a liberal think tank based in Budapest. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of the European Liberal Forum, the party foundation of the ALDE party. We're very lucky we have 5 distinguished guests, but we also have very little time. And we have to discuss an issue, the future of Europe and the challenges we face, which is not something we could really solve in 90 minutes or not even in 900 or 9,000 minutes. So we will have to be very brief and very straightforward. The way we'll do this is after I introduce our panelists, there will be short opening statements. Then we will have a discussion reflecting on the statements of one another, and then we will give the floor to you for questions and comments, which I will ask you to be brief about. So once again, thank you, and thank you our distinguished guests who are here today with us. I will start from left to right in introducing our guests. On the left, we have Vít Beneš, from the Czech Republic. He works in international relations, and he's done a lot of work in EU-related issues, EU integration, and the institutional aspects of that. Next, we have Lubor Lacina. Did I pronounce it correctly? Lubor Lacina comes from also Czech Republic in Brno. He's an economist, so he will be giving us a few thoughts about the economic dimension of the European integration and of the challenges we face in Europe, maybe dimension too often overlooked, maybe not involved enough in discussions about political science and international relations issue. Then we have Anna Orosz from Hungary, who is on the board of Momentum movement, which is a new Hungarian political movement bringing generational change and new ideas into Hungary. And I'm sure Anna will discuss a bit more about her organization and how she sees the future of the European Union. Then we're very, very happy to have His Honorable Excellency Christopher Izrang, Germany's ambassador to Prague, who's held a number of diplomatic posts, been with the Chancellor for 8.5 years, and is here to talk not exclusively about the German elections, which he as a diplomat, of course, will have to avoid when it comes to party politics. And last but not least, Mats Braun, who is originally from Sweden but lives in Prague now, a political scientist, and who works on the Europeanization of different policy areas and other issues. So that will be our panel. And if you look at this sheet that we got, we're supposed to be discussing issues such as separatism, nationalism, populism, future of liberal democracy, chance that Brexit will have an impact, basically everything that goes with the challenges that Europe faces. In the beginning, we heard that this conference grew up from the idea that Institute of Politics and Society believed that there might be crises in Europe, but instead of crises, we now talk about challenges. But what are some of those challenges? And to start with, I will ask each participant to give an opening statement outlining the 3 key challenges he or she believes the European Union faces. Now, of course, we can all list a number of challenges, but I would be very interested to see what are the focal points, what are the key challenges for our participants. Please do not be afraid of being even repetitive. If some of the challenges you see are similar, that's of course no problem. That's in the nature of what we're discussing. Once we've identified these 3 challenges in about 5 minutes each, and of course if you want you can give solutions to those challenges. So not only we will analyze Europe, but we'll also solve some of the problems in the first 30 minutes. So once we've identified those challenges, we will have a discussion about those. We'll see how much we agree on what the toughest issues facing Europe are. Then we'll reflect, and as I said, we will then involve the audience. So without further ado, in the opening statements, we will follow the order of the table. So Vít Beneš, I will ask you to become first. What are the 3 key challenges facing Europe?
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. I'll start straight away because we don't have enough time. The first challenge, the title of this panel is Quo Vadis Europe, and I think that this is the first challenge. Quo Vadis, Europe does not know where it's going. What I mean by that, Europe does not know what can or what should be its finalité. In the past, we used to have a lively debate about the finality of European integration. Today, we have no such discussion, whether we want a federal Europe, like truly federal, whether we want something like Europe as an empire, whether we want Europe as international organization. Even though Mr. Juncker proposed some scenarios, none of them tackles these fundamental issues about European finality. It's a pressing question because we are in a period of intensified deepening of the European integration in the wake of the economic crisis. Yet the whole integration process proceeds as some kind of project-based process. We have no broader, no wider ideas about where we are going in terms of what we want the EU to become. The second challenge is democratic deficit. It's not an academic question. To put it simply, people living in Europe do not have the means and the procedures how to shape EU policies and how to decide who will be in power. There are two aspects of this democratic deficit. The first, EU institutions which are not democratically accountable to EU citizens, despite some piecemeal steps. And the second aspect rests in the fact that the EU is governed by nation states, which means that we as EU citizens are transferring our sovereignty to foreign governments who are not accountable to me. 27 out of 28 governments sitting at the European Council are in no way accountable to me. And this is very painful for countries like Greece, for example, which feels that they were simply dictated some policy by other governments, and these governments are in no way accountable to them. Yeah, and that's the third challenge, the political accountability. Today you will hear many proposals about substantive challenges. I don't know, migration crisis, economic crisis. You will hear proposals for another project, integration projects like fiscal union, coordination of migration policy, whatever. The problem is that we don't know who bears the political accountability if things go wrong. Democracy is about having tools, having mechanisms for changing policy and changing people in power if people feel that things go in the wrong direction. We do not have political accountability in Europe. Everybody is accountable and nobody is accountable at the same time.
Thank you so much. You've identified very broad and structural challenges. So I think we will be able to get back to some of those. But now let's hear from Lubor Latina. Maybe he will focus more on economic challenges as well, or maybe he won't. The floor is yours.
Well, the question if we can name it as challenges, but as we mentioned, the feeling of most of the Europeans is that we are just moving from the crisis to crisis. If you look to the EU from the rest of the world, it's still the region with almost the highest living standards, which are growing. If we look to the European integration process, it won the competition with the former central planning approach. So this kind of successful process, so one of the challenge from the economic point of view is to keep this level of living standards which are very attractive and to keep and to stimulate the whole system, which will enable final economic growth. I would be very afraid when during the crisis was the discussions that we should find kind of new system of non or zero growing economy. I think it's very dangerous, and I like that those discussions disappear from the economic discussion. So to keep living standards and to stimulate the system that they can grow further, I think that's very important for EU and also for the rest of the world. Second, during the economic crisis, a lot of people were afraid that there will be the new wave of protectionism, which didn't appear, and it's very positive. So again, I think the EU, and that's a challenge for EU, is to play the positive role if there are any attempts from, for example, the US presidency to introduce new protectionist measures to fight against this, because I think we perfectly prove here in Europe that the open market is something which leads at the end to the growth of living standards. And the last challenge, again, we are quite critical to the success of European integration process, but when I meet with my former classmates from countries like Angola, Nigeria, or recently we have a big group of students from Africa, and they are the biggest fan of European integration. They believe that something like the European and especially economic integration is the future of the success of African continent, the integration of the African continent to the global economy. So the export of those success stories to African continents, I think that's a third big challenge for European Union in the near future.
Thank you so much. I think we've just had a typical case of is the glass half full or half empty, where Vit described many of the problems we had. Lubor reminded us that, you know, in many of the challenges start with keeping something that we already have. Anna, I will turn to you now. As I mentioned, you're from a new political movement in Hungary, so in addition to describing those challenges, maybe you can tell a few words about momentum to us.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for the invitation to this incredibly interesting conference and to this panel discussion. And yes, I am on the board of a new political movement, a new political party of Hungary. This political movement is called Momentum, and it was established 2 years ago. And it used to be an underground organization until early this year, when we launched a huge campaign in order to organize a referendum on whether Hungary should host the Olympic Games in 2024 or not. Maybe you have heard of it, maybe not. It turned out to be a huge success. We collected almost 300,000 signatures within Budapest, which is a huge number in Hungarian terms. And since then, we are growing, and we are building our organization, and we are getting prepared for the 2018 parliamentary elections. Although most of the members of the party are from the young generation, born around the regime change, more or less, we do not only want to represent the young people in Hungary, but all those people who are very simply saying fed up with the very deep left-right divide of the country, and who would rather want to focus on solving our problems, and who think that the question is not anymore so much about left or right, being social democrat or conservative, but rather about closing up or opening up, or west or east or Russia or Europe. And for us, no matter whether we come from a left or a right background, the answer is very clear to this question. We want to belong to Europe, we want to go towards Europe, and we want to, like, although we acknowledge the challenges and the problems and the criticism towards Europe, European Union and globalization, we think that the only way in the future is towards being open and tackling these challenges together. So, I hope I didn't take up too much time advertising our new political movement.
You still have 3 minutes.
Okay. So the three most important challenges that I try to structure in my mind before coming to this panel were, like, the first one, like, looking at Europe from a more Eastern European perspective. I think our biggest concern is the marginalization of Eastern Europe. Which we clearly see as a result of the regressive and Euro-destructive policies of, for instance, Mr. Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary. And we think that governments like Hungary, who were reluctant to cooperate on policies such as the migration policies in the European Union, have contributed to a large degree to the fact that today we are talking about a multi-speed Europe. And this leads me to the question whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I think we might discuss whether it's good or bad, but most importantly, this is an inevitable process which is already happening. And in my opinion, it's rather a good thing, because if people start to feel that it's a real threat, that their countries can become marginalized within Europe and that they might lose their position within Europe, I do believe that voters can say no to populist governments like Mr. Orbán's government. I also think that the only way forward within the EU for us Hungarians is to be part of the core. And to support common policy areas like security, defense, migration, and of course the energy union, which is key to the independence of the EU. Another major issue is, of course, migration, about which I don't want to talk too much. Of course, it's a long-term issue. We need to find long-term solutions, and we need to cooperate on this, because migration is by no means a matter of national competence, in my view. And the third thing, which we perhaps haven't touched upon so much today yet, is the Russian expansionism and the hybrid warfare. I think this is something we should also deal with on a European level by common security and security policy and defense capability. And on a national level, we need to focus on cyber warfare and strategic communication centers, and of course support the East Stratcom, the functioning of the East Stratcom task force. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, so much. Three very different challenges: Eastern Europe's role in the European Union, migration, and Russian expansion, which was, of course, a bit discussed in the previous panel. Your Excellency, thank you again for being here with us. I will ask also you to address the three challenges, but of course I have to ask you to say something about the German elections, how you view it. I know you can't comment on party politics, and that's not your role, but someone who's been with Chancellor Merkel, maybe just a few impressions that you have are also, I think, something the audience would love to hear.
Well, good afternoon. First of all, thank you for the kind invitation. I'm happy to be here. It has been a long night, I have to confess. Of course, on the one hand, you see some continuity when it comes to the election outcome. So there are still parties ahead, well, with a clear majority that are likely to follow the pro-European approach that the previous German government adopted, and the only party in the parliament, or the two parties that would question that general approach, the left on the one side and the AfD on the other side, are far from being part of any new government, and both of them are below 13%. So there is a sign of stability. On the other hand, the two major party blocs, the CDU-CSU on the one side and the Social Democrats on the other side, have both lost considerably. And that is going to be interesting how this further continues with them. Some commentators have said those will be good for German democracy if not both of them are in the government. Well, we will have to see that if this turns out this way. Now, turning to the challenges, I think one should remember what the European Union is all about. I think it's mainly about providing security, overcoming nationalism, and improving the economic and social well-being of European citizens in general. And all of this is challenged right now. And so one has to confess that the European Union and its member states are not yet optimally prepared for these challenges. So what are these challenges exactly? I would group them into two groups, one internal and one external. The internal I would divide into two parts so that we arrive at three challenges in total. The one is the value basis that is challenged. I think the original idea was to have common approaches, to have a clear set of values like democracy, rule of law, freedom of the media, solidarity. And there are some questions about this internally. This previous speaker just alluded to that. But then the other group of internal challenges is just the housekeeping aspects that we have to prepare for better cohesion, digitalization, that we offer economic perspectives, but also deal with Brexit, which is also, of course, a challenge. This is the housekeeping internal aspect. When it comes to external challenges, of course, one is more economic and globalization. As my previous boss, the Chancellor, used to say, the world is not waiting for Europe. The world is moving very rapidly, and we have to be aware that Europe will be a smaller part in the world in the coming years. Not only a size of population, but also an economic strength, and so we really have to stay innovative. The world, as she says, is not waiting for us. The other one is, of course, security. That was also alluded at previously by some external challenges. To the east, but also to the south. Migration was mentioned, and there it's all about regaining control to a certain degree, and to solve the challenges together we have as a European Union. I stop here, but maybe later on we can talk about some ideas to solving these. Thanks.
For some of the specifics, certainly we will. Thank you so much for your contribution. And now we turn to Mats Braun. I realize now that, of course, being the last to list the challenges might be more challenging, but then you can also relate to some of the things that were discussed. The floor is yours.
And thank you very much for the invitation to come here as well. And I think it's a privilege to be the last speaker to address the main challenges that Europe or European Union is facing right now. And I realized that I kind of cheated on my homework when I look at my list of challenges here, because they're all very much interrelated. And the main challenge I would like to outline is that of political legitimacy of the European Union. And the other sub-challenges then, the first one of those is politicization. The second one is differentiation. My colleague here, Witt Benisch, already talked about the democratic deficit. I would like to stress that there is a big difference between political legitimacy and democracy. That is, on my account, I would state that you could argue that the European Union has less of a problem with being democratic than it has with its political legitimacy. But the political legitimacy is about finding acceptance and support for the system of decision-making within the European Union. And we can argue today but the European Union has a democratic system. We can discuss things that could be improved, we can discuss problems on very many specific issues, but overall we could argue that there is a case for that the problem with democratic deficit is not as big as is sometimes stated. On the other hand, the problem of support and acceptance for the decision-making within the EU is a major issue. Now, the problem here, and that is linked to my second challenge, which I put here, politicization, is that many proposed solutions to democratic deficit problem might actually undermine the legitimacy of the European Union as such. That is, we can take one concrete example here. In order to have more people coming to the elections of the European Parliament, it was this idea of having a Spitzenkandidat and a top candidates competing for the office as the president of the European Commission, which was kind of initiated by the biggest fractions in the European Parliament without broader support of other EU institutions. And now, what does that lead? It leads to a politicization of the European Commission, but from my perspective actually could be a potential risk of undermining the legitimacy of the European Union. If we go backwards in time here to think of, okay, just to try to be a bit more concrete what I'm saying here, where does the European Union get its legitimacy from? We often talk about that it's legitimate due to what it produces, what it achieves. That is, if the European Union delivers, people will be more willing to support it, right? And now, an essential part in producing that would be a relatively fairly neutral commission, being viewed as much of a broker between different interests among the member states. And now, more of a politicization of a commission could be a challenge to that. Okay, moving on to my third point here, differentiation. Differentiation, in my understanding, is more of a positive challenge. That is, we talked, or previous speakers talked about the issue of a multi-speed Europe. I would rather use the concept differentiated integration for the reason that multi-speed kind of indicates that you have different parts of Europe moving at different speeds to the same common target. Now, this is a debate which, if you look at academic sources, you can trace this debate back to the 1970s even. Been discussions about if all countries can actually manage to cope with the different parts of EU's child legislation, etc. But what is new is perhaps this, that the differentiation might be more permanent time-wise, that you're not talking about multi-speed, but rather different groups of member states having different kinds of integration. The question is then, is that bad necessarily? Perhaps not. It can be also a way to avoid situations where all 27, 28 member states will not be able to find a mutual agreement. Of course, there is one big important thing here, which is also linked to what you will talk about in the next panel today, the Brexit issue. And that is, differentiation cannot, in my view, challenge or contradict the basic components of a single market. And I think actually the UK will see at the end of those Brexit negotiations that it might be very hard to opt out from the single market. And that is also perhaps the biggest strength of the European Union, the single market, which is very, very difficult to move out of. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your challenges, especially as they relate to my next question when it comes to multi-speed Europe, or as you said, differentiated integration. Thank you so much for these challenges. Now, I would like to get to our next point, which concerns sort of the multi-speed Europe, but also the issue of populism. And the way I want to bring forward is, you might know, I'm from Hungary. We Hungarians are sometimes obsessed with Mr. Viktor Orbán and what his government does. But if I look at the challenges that you all mentioned, one could make the argument that whatever populists in general, and specifically arguments in Hungary and Poland, these governments are saying, they have an answer to these challenges. They have an answer to their sort of answer. They have an answer as to where Europe should be going. It should be going back to the nation states because there's already too much power in Europe. They have an answer to migration. We don't want any migrants. They have an answer to how to keep the living standards. Well, we keep the living standards by not getting any more messed up and not building a big bureaucracy. They have an answer to differentiate integration. Well, we don't mind. We'll do our own thing. Is he right? Or are these people right? Of course, this is my first question. But the second, maybe more important question to you is there a counter-argument? Or is the problem the fact that there is no one counter-argument, but it's more sophisticated? How does one respond to this fairly coherent populist narrative, which combines sort of Euroscepticism with a sort of populism? How does one respond to that? Or maybe the response is that some of these elements are right, and we don't have to keep the order now, so we can go in whatever order you want. Also, you can, of course, reflect on one another. Go ahead.
Just a quick reaction to what you have just said. You said that people like Orbán have a solution, a Europe of nation states. Look. It's very, very, very easy to implement this kind of solution, Europe of nation states. You just leave the EU. The very fact that Hungary is not leaving the EU is an evidence that Orbán himself does not believe in this solution. So I don't think he has a solution in terms of having a Europe of nation states. And one more comment about populism. Look, populism is the other side of the coin with democracy. Democracy and the border between democracy and populism is very often fuzzy. Democracy is about populism, and when democracy was born in France, for example, it was a populist revolution, and in fact it was what we would say national revival, so maybe a nationalist revolution. So it's very. I don't agree with the idea that populism is a problem. I probably think that we have too much populism on the national level, but too little populism on the European level. We have no European populists who would be able to sell an EU-wide program in simple terms. So that would be my provocative answer.
Okay, that was provocative.
I will just perhaps add to that and agree with most of the things that Vit said here. And the real question is, who is a populist here? I mean, because we can label various different political groups, political parties as populists at various times. So the question is a definition here. Who is the populist? And I mean, one definition which would be possible to make use of is populist would be a person who tries to outline that there is a corrupt political elite that is ruling a country, and thus the populist is then the person speaking on behalf of the true people, right? But of course, that is not always a bad thing to do. You can have a positive incentives in some situations, but if you look at a bit broader speaking, and if we link populism to the criticism of the European Union, there's a lot of this going on the level of a member state, and not only among the political parties that we would normally label populist. If we take, for instance, the issue of migration crisis, mentioned here today and also in the morning here, this is often addressed in a very populist way. If you would take the Czech Republic, I would claim that all political parties in this country, with perhaps one or two exceptions, have addressed this issue in a very populist way, scapegoating Brussels for decision-making in a way which kind of puts this cleavage of an elite over there deciding against their will and ignoring some of the aspects of how these policies have been produced and decided upon in the first place. So this is a little bit something which we could keep in mind.
Yep. It's not my role to reflect. Of course, populism itself is something we could debate for a very long time. But I think when we talk about the populist challenge to the European establishment, we we sort of think about the same thing, even if we can't agree on that. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
I am not expert on negotiations, but when you ask the question if we should have more opt-outs from common standards, I would be afraid if you have too many ideas, it's then difficult to find the common position. I would prefer to really come back and discuss, and Germany or French should be the leader of those discussions. What are really the common policies with significantly high added value which we can run together, rather to ask the member countries to come with their own ideas. And I'm afraid if there is 27 different ideas, we will have big difficulties to find something common.
What I wanted to add to what Mr. Benner said about the fact that there is too little populism on the European level and too much populism on the national level, if I understand your argument correctly, I completely agree with that, and I would add that in Hungary the only party that manages to frame European affairs in a populistic way is the government, is the Fidesz party, which puts billboards on the streets saying we should stop Brussels, and all other parties are just, so I think for the people Europe and Brussels is something very far away that they just cannot grasp and they cannot understand and they don't feel a link to. And another thing to the, going back to the multi-speed topic, I wanted to mention is that I think I also agree that it's not necessarily a bad thing to differentiate among member states, but I would also strongly underline that it's very important to keep those on the periphery, so to say, motivated to join the core. This is something I think is one of the most important challenges if we really go along this way.
Well, thank you. I think when talking about different concepts, one should keep in mind that the challenges we all talked about can only be tackled together. It's clear to the German government that the German government cannot solve these challenges itself. It needs strong partners, and the best partners are our neighbors in the European Union. And we have to try to convince our national audiences that we can only face these challenges if we stay together as a European Union. I would like to also come back to two things mentioned in the first statement by Beneš about the finalité. I would be cautious there because this is shifting. If you look at the debate in the 60s or 70s about the finalité, the picture was completely different. So I think that would be difficult to define this right now once and forever, but to keep it an open process, but also to take into account the concerns that we face now in many countries. And not to overburden our electorates with too far-reaching integration concepts. He also talked about the lack of democracy. Of course, this poses the question of what is actually the demos here. Is it 27 groups of citizens, or is it just one group of European citizens? And I have my doubts if we already reached the point that we really have one European, one vote. Right now we don't have that. The relative weight of a Maltese voter is much stronger than of a Czech voter or a German voter. And I think we are not ready to have one European demos here. So I think there are some restrictions to the pure democratic basic ideas. I share those comments about the flexible union and differentiated integration, but as was said by the previous speaker, it's very important to keep it open, to keep those at the periphery motivated to join, and keep it open for them to actually join. But it can motivate to a certain degree to move ahead, to have some differentiation there, because so far the basis we have so far, if it's not put into question even further, is strong enough to allow that.
Just add one quick thing on the finalité debate. I mean, it's not that long ago that we had a big debate, which was about to kind of set what is the final direction of the European Union. If we go back to the Convention on the Future of Europe in 2002, and in the aftermath thereafter, I remember also in relation to the failed constitutional treaty, there was the initiative of the Commission to have a dialogue D, or I don't remember the proper title there, but it was an attempt to have a big debate again on the future. And from my perspective, this is very risky. I think we try to discuss where the project should end up. We end up by having more of polarization, which I think is kind of a false understanding of the issue at stake, actually, to have this big debate between federalists, intergovernmentalists, etc. It's rather better to focus on the actual policy issues at stake. Thank you.
Vit, I will turn to you. If I understand correctly, and maybe I will exaggerate, but the speakers say, well, the finality is either something we should not necessarily strive for, or it's impossible. And I might add my own point is that really something we can find? Isn't the reason that we don't have a clear answer as to where Europe wants to go, that, you know, people just have two different opinions about that, you know, where Germany wants to go might be very different. Is that something that can or should be solved?
You know, the problem from my point of view is that we don't have the reflexivity today. You know, when we were concluding Maastricht Treaty, we knew or we thought that Maastricht is heading towards a distant goal of EU as a federation. And there was a discussion, there were reflections about that. Today we are heading in some direction, but there is no or very little reflection about this kind of direction. So I'm arguing in favor of reflection. I believe that we are heading not towards federation, but something like Europe as an empire. But there is very little discussion whether it's the direction we should take. And I should also tackle the issue of the missing European demos. You know, this is the old argument of those who are in favor of intergovernmental Europe. The problem is that in intergovernmental Europe, I, as a European, am governed by foreign governments who are in no way accountable to me. So the no demos thesis is, I would say, a hypocritical argument which says, look, you are not European enough, therefore we are right to deny you an EU-level democratic process, and you need to be governed by foreign governments. So, I consider the argument that there is no European demos as an hypocritical argument made by national governments, which justifies the illegitimate nature of today's EU governance. And the second problem with the no demos argument is that those who repeat this argument believe that you need some kind of ethnocultural nation for a democratic processes to be set up. I don't think so.
Are we heading towards, I will ask you this question, are we heading towards a European empire, or is that something that, that for instance, Germany would be interested in? Because we've just heard that's the direction we're taking now. I disagree with that, but I want to hear your argument on is there a direction Europe is taking, or is it more like a muddling through process?
Well, I think this is a difficult question to tackle. Just one thing that comes to my mind. To the ordinary citizen, does he feel more represented by his national government or by institutions in Europe? And probably right now, most of the citizens feel more represented by their national governments. So there could be an identification gap right now if we go to a European demos right away at this point of time. It might be desirable in the long run, and you could argue in favor of that, but I don't think that this will actually strengthen Europe's role among all citizens in Europe at this very point of time.
Well, I don't want to comment really on the empire concept, because I think that would account for a much longer debate, and we can go back to, I mean, this concept is sometimes used in academic literature, but it would have to be discussed in a more detailed way. I just want to react to the question here of governed by foreign governments. My take of it would be that this is too much of a simplification, right? Of course you have a qualified majority procedure, but on the other hand you have so many actors being involved in the actual decision making at the EU level. So I can't really see how we could describe the situation. Of course you can end up, as in the case with the so-called refugee quotas and the Visegrad countries, of being in a losing minority on an issue where, in a policy field where it was not widely understood that there is qualified majority voting. I'm saying not widely understood because the practice tended to be more consensual within this concrete policy field. So then perhaps you could have such a feeling afterwards, but I wouldn't say it's correct. I would say that there are too many different bodies involved in the decision making for this to be correct.
Some of the challenges you faced, I think, were somewhat theoretical, and of course, from an academic, as also an academic, I could follow. But let me pose, I think, a more specific question that also raises the issue of European empire and how strong Europe should or should not be, and whether there's a unified European concept. You are aware, of course, that in at least two countries, Poland and Hungary in particular, there are many claims, serious allegations or violations of fundamental issues, rule of law issues, human rights issues, issues which many believe, certainly I think in Brussels, violate certain democratic principles in the European Union. I understand there's even discussion about using some of the European funds or withdrawing some of the European funds as incentive to change those things. Do you believe that Europe, let that be the Commission, any other European body or anybody else, any other organ in the European Union, do you believe Europe has a responsibility to step in and try to exert influence on some of those processes that are going on in Poland and Hungary, to try to pull these countries back towards a more European dimension, whatever that might be? Or should these countries, they have democratically elected government, these governments do what they want, these governments are responsible to the people, and this is not something that Europe should interfere in? I think I will try by this example to bring the discussion about a direction of Europe into a more specific dimension. Is this something that Europe needs to step in, be concerned with, or is this something that we shouldn't discuss? This is for the nation states to decide. Anna, maybe you want to start, as coming from Hungary. What's your position on this issue?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I think Europe should definitely play a role in sort of putting the big red stop signal to Poland and Hungary and all these countries that you have mentioned. And I also think that like one of the biggest concerns of the people is that all these cohesion and structural funds have been spent in an irresponsible way, and there are huge corruption scandals associated with this, and that we have many foregone opportunities. And I do think, and I do see that people actually expect the EU to step in and to start or to establish institutions like the prosecutor's office, who could create a more transparent and clearer and more effective, most importantly, way of spending all this EU money. So yes, my answer is a definite yes.
Before giving the floor to, I would like to react in one sentence. Some would argue that, or at least I hear the argument that if a Hungarian opposition politician wants European interference, that just plays into the card of populists saying, well, you know, these opponents of Orban, or I'm sure it happens in Poland, these opponents of the PiS government always want Europe, and it actually plays on the strength of populists. How would you respond to that argument?
Yeah, that's true, and it's a difficult argument to tackle. On the other hand, Europe chose the way not to interfere in the past years, and we can see that this is not a solution to this problem. So I think we just have to go the other way and find solutions to take the wind out of these political arguments.
Well, I think it's the European integration process is a long-term project. So to answer your question, I think that you should ignore it. At the end, you can observe that, as I already mentioned, the European project, market-oriented economy, already won the competition with the former project in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think much more smarter strategy would be to make the EU and to spend the energy to make the EU project more attractive, and then even those Polish and Hungarian politicians will look if it's attractive, then probably we will change our mind. So I think strategically I would not push too much on them.
Thank
you. Whether the European Union should protect the values of democracy and push the member states, it's a difficult question. You know, the problem is that who in the EU should do that? The EU has no constitutional court to enforce some core principles, core constitutional principles. So who else should do that? The Council? You know, the Council is a political body. It represents member states of different colors. So I don't think the Council is the suitable body to enforce this kind of constitutional principles. And so I think that the EU is in such an early stage of integration that it simply cannot do that. And of course, there is always the question that with the EU, you always have the problem that if the EU itself applies for EU membership, it would not fulfill Copenhagen criteria of democratic governance. I'm going back to my first comments, introductory.
So I would have a similar understanding there perhaps, but if primary or EU secondary law is violated, then the issue is quite straightforward. But the problem is, of course, that there is no one model, no one blueprint when it comes to the constitutional arrangement of a specific member state. So thus, it might be tricky to intervene to talk about the position of a constitutional court of a specific country. I mean, we have member states where you don't have a court which would be of the equivalent, in the equivalent position. Take the Scandinavian countries, for instance. So for that, UK. So for that matter, this is a bit a tricky matter. But of course, if a country violates its own constitution, then it's quite straightforward.
You're referring to the Polish example, obviously. I would turn to you as well, and specifically on this specific issue, there were certain, it was not government position, but there were certain politicians who say, well, one thing that is possible to do is understanding European solidarity in a way that also applies to certain European funds. If you are not playing by our rules, let that be migration quota, let that be other issues, maybe we should rethink EU funds, maybe we should rethink the solidarity of EU funds. How do you feel about connecting those two issues, financial assistance to some of these wrongly behaving countries with how they behave when it comes to democracy or migration issues?
I think the German Chancellor responded to that by saying that there should not be a direct link in that question. When you did the previous question, I think Europe needs to be concerned if there are basic values put into question in its member states, but it should observe and it should make every effort to promote our joint values in a smart way, just as previous speakers also said. Too early, too direct, too massive intervention might actually worsen the problem. But of course, if there are certain clear rules, red lines are missed, like you alluded at, and then there is also the response is foreseen in the treaties.
Thank you. I would like to go back to one possible solution, which is, of course, the multi-speed Europe, or the differentiated integration of Europe. And I want to ask you about this issue, and then I will open up the floor for questions and comments from the audience to our distinguished speakers. But to frame this question, one possible, I would say, solution, or at least an attempt at solution at some of the crises or some of the challenges you mentioned, is, of course, a multi-speed Europe, a core Europe versus a periphery Europe, differentiated integration, whatever you want to call it. But the notion that those countries that want to move forward faster should be able to do that, no matter in what institutional framework. Those countries, maybe it's the Eurozone, maybe it's another zone, and that would actually solve many of these problems. You would have countries in the periphery, and if they violate certain rules, we'll let them do that, but then they cannot be part of a core Europe, of a more integrated Europe. Is that, first of all, a feasible scenario, and second of all, is that a scenario Europe should pursue? And third of all, do you think, is that the direction we're going there? There are, of course, differences of opinion between the Commission and Mr. Juncker there, and maybe some of the other member states, especially Germany and France. How do you feel about the chances and the feasibility and the desirability of a multi-speed Europe? Go ahead.
We can look on the multi-speed Europe as the opportunity. One of the disadvantages of social science is that we have limited ability of experiment compared with natural technical science. We cannot divide you to two groups, and one group let's starving for 1 month and the other feeding a lot. Compared with chemistry, so the multi-speed Europe, from this point of view, it's kind of experiment. And let's take example of former Czechoslovakia. We had quite a long history. Then we divided 1992. At that point, Slovak economy was like 35% poorer GDP per capita than Czech economy. Then Slovakia decided to run reforms, and they introduced euro exactly at the beginning of Eurozone crisis. So the normal economic argument will be, see, they introduced euro in the wrongest time as possible, and they will have a negative effect of loss of monetary autonomy on the national economy. Well, what's happened if you look to the macroeconomic numbers? They are doing even better than Czech Republic, and this or next year the Slovak Republic will catch up the Czech economy in this GDP per capita variable. So let's look that sometimes the multi-speed Europe can be kind of natural experiments which can prove that the answer which we are always looking in social science, what was first, egg or chicken, should be answered this way. Similar, if you look to the Brexit, most people is afraid of the Brexit. From my point of view, it's a great opportunity, as we can already see. In Britain, they really start discuss right now what will be the losing advantages which was given, which people just accepted. And right now, the Brexit will probably do much more to discuss what are the positives of European integration than any campaign which is led by the official politicians or media. So multi-speed should be an advantage.
I will press you on that point because I understand from an academic point of view the natural experiment. But then from the natural experiment, does it follow that, you know, if the Czech Republic was more integrated, maybe had the euro, that would actually have been more advantageous? Because that's what seems to follow from what you're...
Actually, in the case of Czech and Slovak Republic, the nice thing is that the structure of the economy is very similar right now. So it's really two comparable examples. Well, depends. If you like to be objective, it looks that it doesn't matter if you have euro or Czech crown during the time of economic crisis. Well, then it's more or less something which you are discussing in this panel, the political decision. The decision if you like to be part of the core of the EU integration or to be a periphery with the lower or less stronger voice in negotiations.
Please.
Well, to a certain degree, we already have a multiple-speed Europe with Schengen and the euro, just as two examples. I would also make a difference between differentiated integration or differentiated Europe and core Europe. Core is just one block, whereas a differentiated Europe could be, there's one group in one area that moves ahead and another group with different countries in another area. And I would argue in favor of such a concept of a flexible approach because it will contribute to preserving the unity because it takes into account the different levels of ambition of individual countries. But it's very important, as we said before, to keep it open and to keep other countries staying outside of a particular integration project, motivated to join later.
Yes, I agree with a lot of what's already said, but just to add to that, if we would discuss in terms of core and periphery, the real periphery would be Norway in that case, or Iceland, being part of a single market but not of a European Union. But I don't think really perhaps the use of core periphery would be the best terms to use here, rather, as mentioned here, that the differentiation then of various kinds that you have. And you also already have another issue which is linked to this, is the possibility of using the procedure of enhanced cooperation within the treaty framework to move ahead in specific policy fields. So I think we already have differentiation. And then the perhaps more interesting question is, what would be disadvantageous for concrete member states of not being part of all the policies in more concrete terms, Czech Republic and the euro, and what actually does it mean for the Czech Republic not to have a euro when it comes to decision making regarding the single market? Does it matter? Doesn't it matter? And this is a question, of course, which is linked to Brexit. What will happen after the UK will not be in there to speak for those countries not having the euro? Of course, you will have Sweden there still, Denmark, but these will be mainly smaller member states still. So that, of course, is a discussion which we can have. But the question is if that is the most fruitful debate, if it's come to taking a political decision in a member state on the euro or not. Because this is very much kind of threatening what happens if you're not in the core. And I'm not sure if that's really the positive debate you would like to have. Thank you.
Yeah, I understand that the term differentiated integration is more politically correct, and core and periphery is a bit of tricky. The problem is the reality. In reality, we do not have different countries participating in different projects. No, in reality, we have a group of countries which participates in all projects. And that's called, that more or less overlaps with Eurozone. That's one problem. The second problem is that, we are not there yet, but we are moving in the direction of institutionalization of this kind of core Europe. We already have some very nascent institutions of Eurozone, we do not have Eurozone with legal subjectivity yet, but we could be there in a few years. And if we get in that position, we will have a new organization which will pose a challenge to the EU, institutional and power challenge to the EU itself. There could be a clash of competencies between these two institutions. So the path we are on has a very serious ramifications in terms of institutions, coherence of Europe, power within Europe. So the concept of differentiated integration and different states participating in different projects, there's the project-based integration I was speaking at the beginning, may look interesting, but the reality is different. We have core of countries which participates in all projects.
Anna?
Yeah, I agree with most of what you said, and I also see that it's already a multi-speed Europe with Eurozone, with Schengen, with the European Economic Area, and so on and so forth. And I also would rather keep my optimistic view on this and say that multi-speed Europe is rather an opportunity for us to shake up this sort of standstill, if we can name it like that. That has dominated Europe in the past decade, let's say, and also an opportunity for those hesitant to move towards a deeper integration, to rethink their position and to be motivated again to belong to the core of the Europe, to the core. And yes, I agree that it brings us to practical problems which should be thought about and which should be dealt with before we actually get there.
Thank you for those answers. I will try to summarize, but I think most of you said that the multi-speed Europe is, whether we like it or not, something that's already happening. We can debate whether we call it core Europe or just differentiation. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions from the audience? I see 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, let's start there, and then we'll 1, 2, 3, 5. I've counted those 5. Let's maybe take them in groups of 2 or 3, and then we can answer. Please go ahead.
So my first quick point or question is about whether the EU should intervene when countries abandon the basic core principles of the EU. And while everyone looks at Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, there's been astonishing silence when you look at what's happening in Catalonia on the part of the Spanish government. And would anyone from the panel like to comment on that? And my other brief point is on the multi-speed Europe. I think the biggest challenge is the political challenge of saying no to a country that doesn't meet the criteria, even when it massages, with the help of Goldman Sachs, the figures that show that it meets the criteria. I'm talking about Greece, for example. You know, the gift that Greece has given Europe is the rise of populism. You were talking about that. It certainly had an impact on Brexit, no doubt about that.
Thank you. Our second question was there. We'll take 3 questions and then...
Josef Brož, dobré odpoledne. Mně se líbilo, že jsme se tady vlastně...
Wait a second.
Pardon. Chci říct, že si myslím, že to podstatné, o čem jsme se tady odpoledne bavili, je to, co se pohybovalo mezi panem Brownem a mezi pánem tady vpravo, čili řekl bych mezi demokratickou legitimitou a to, co tady přímo nezaznělo, ale politickou suverenitou. To slovo tady nebylo a myslím si, že stojí za to, aby bylo zmíněno. Čili to napětí, to je vlastně ten kolotoč, v kterém se pohybujeme v současné Evropě. To je taková moje poznámka, čili populismus jako určitá reakce na nedostatek demokratické legitimity, která se třeba projeví různými pokusy pana Orbána nebo v Polsku různými konzervativními kotrmelci ohledně různého soudnictví, které ale vlastně reaguje ještě na komunistické určité dědictví. To bychom neměli zapomínat. Čili tato otázka si myslím stojí stále před náma a je otevřená a myslím si, že každá země na to nějakým způsobem bude muset reagovat. Ve Francii všimněte si, že třeba Macron je vlastně najednou takový monarcha. To tam dlouho za Hollanda nebylo, to byl takový nudný, trošku směšný možná pán. Co Francie řeší vlastně tuto chvíli sama ze sebou? Co vlastně bude řešit Německo sama ze sebou s těmi 12,6%? Čili je to otázka politické legitimity a zároveň otázka demokratické legitimity a zároveň politické suverenity. Jestli je to suverenita dědičná, jak kdysi o legitimitě mluvil Max Weber, nebo je to nějaká charismatická záležitost, jako je u těch populistů, nebo jsme tou Evropou těch byrokratů, čili úředníci to za nás vyřeší. To si myslím, že je otevřená otázka a finalita Evropské unie, promiňte, není. Finalita není. Finalitou je pouze smrt. My máme nějakou pokus o vizi, o transcendentní, nějaký pokusy, že Evropská unie byla založena jako transcendentní projekt. A moje otázka zní, jak se díváte na nápad pana Junckera, aby byl konkrétní, spojit předsednictví Evropské rady s předsednictvím Evropské komise, čili politizovat Evropu. Děkuji. Kdo chce odpoví.
Thank you. And we'll have the third question, and then we'll start the next round with Mr. Ivanovich. Yes.
Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. I'd like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your professional time today. Picking up a thread from Ambassador Israel in the need to have everyone involved in policy making, I'd like to suggest that there are two programs in the European Union now which, though in their infancy, can in fact grow to an alternative set of tools. Those are the single digital market and, of course, the open data program. I would like to suggest that the concepts of either a single-speed Europe or a multi-speed Europe are indeed somewhat obsolescent. It is because for the first time in history, with devices such as this, which everyone has, and they're pretty solid, it is now possible to drill down into local communities and to see the problems that need to be addressed by local men and women who are concerned about their local communities, about their home, about their country. And that yet the grand concepts, the project of the European Union, suggest, in fact, a responsive government, not a multi-speed government, a responsive European government, a responsive American government, that uses this pretty robust technology, in fact, to measure for the first time in history what are the problems and to go through procedures using open data, using the digital economies to respond, to try those experiments the social scientists are trying to do without having to sit back and wait to see what happens in 10 years. In fact, it is the local men and women throughout Europe and across America who have these pretty tough devices, who know in their communities what needs to be fixed. And I would like to suggest, and I'd like to hear from you, how do you see the longer-term development using tools such as have been introduced for a European digital single market, open data, and others? Because the Brexit example is, in fact, I would suggest, a mistake. Because if you leave the table, you cannot discuss how to improve the results. And so I would suggest that what is needed is responsive government, and that involves citizen initiatives, citizen participation, to get concrete results. And this will negate the negative aspects of populism because I think it's deliverable. What do you think?
Thank you. So we had 4 questions. Catalonia saying no to people who break the rules, the joint presidency, and local government and technology. You can tackle those questions or any and all of those questions in any order you see fit. Yes, please do.
Well, I will try to give an answer to some of the questions that were raised. First, Catalonia. It's interesting to see that both sides basically refer to basic values of democracy. In Catalonia, people say, well, we want to be separate, let's ask people. let's have the referendum. On the other side, the Spanish authorities say, well, we have a clear set of rules established, and so they should follow the rules, and they are not following the rules right now. So this is something, I guess, because we both with some right refer to some basic values, it's difficult to have an outside intervention on that. What I do hope, of course, is that they find a way somehow together, and hopefully without any violence on either side. When it comes to the euro and rules, no surprise that Germany is, of course, in favor of any clear rules. That's also why our Minister of Finance was a little bit critical about the parts of the Juncker speech when he called for more members of the Eurozone without being too strict on the fulfillment of criteria. When it comes to the rest of the Juncker speech, I think people in Berlin are not just now waiting for the formation of the new government and come back. There probably in the course of this week there will be another major speech, this time by President Macron, that also will need some analysis from all of us and to see what we can make out of this. Thank you.
If no one else. So we'll try to pick up on some of the questions here which were raised. If we start with the rules, respecting the rules question here. Of course, if we look at the Stability and Growth Pact, there was a problem there also linked to the quality of the rules, because these rules were not respected. It was not only Greece breaking the rules. Germany broke the rules. France did. Other countries as well. So from that perspective, and to a large degree because the rules were, without being technical, but the demand on the annual focus on annual deficit was a mistake. So, of course, but yes, if we talk about a more general in principle here about differentiation, then of course the question is which would be the borders between the different groups? How easily is it possible to go from one part to another to be part of all the policies included here? And this is, of course, mostly related to the euro then, which are the criteria for introducing the euro reasonable. When it comes to the question about legitimacy and sovereignty there, well, I don't know if I have a short answer to that question, if I understood it correctly. Just stress that the legitimacy I was talking about is more political legitimacy, or rather sociological legitimacy, that is acceptance of decision making. Of course, it's linked to the question of state sovereignty here, but how to discuss more broadly where will Germany move, where will France go, why the development in Poland and Hungary, that would be a very huge debate. Perhaps just one comment there. Maybe we could argue that the enlargement procedure leading up to the 2004 big enlargement in 2007, it was largely celebrated as a great success when we had the 10 years anniversary of this. But perhaps we could now question some of the aspects there. Rather, the question here is if you actually, because we had demands in that enlargement process as well to include civic society actors in consultation procedures and various policies. At the same time, as you had this strong stress on conditionality, that is, implement a huge range of policies. Of course, you could ask the question there, and it's a question for further discussion, if that is having negative consequences for the development of actual working democracy in some of the member states, that the possibility of feeling that citizens could have a feeling of being a part of building a specific society. But I think that is something for a further discussion. Thank you.
Please go.
Well, sure, economists will agree that controlling something is important, so always we can come with a lot of variables which we can state that if you are below 3%, it's perfect. If you are 3.1%, it's already the problem. Well, the problem is even more difficult because if you look, for example, and if you speak with people from Eurostat, they did know that there is something wrong. It was not a new information that the Greek statistics are wrong, but they had no power to come and control how the data are collected in Greece. And when they went for the mission to Greece later, they found that even not collecting some data. If the Brussels said, send us some data, they just put them to the computer and send it, even not collecting them at the regional level. So even the Greek government didn't know what's going on in the Greek economy. So from this point of view, I would be very careful to really push too much information power to some variables because it's very tricky. And the question about to give more political power to Commission, well, why not? But then I first would like start that we have real European political parties. Because without the European political parties, I think there is no sense to have more political commission.
Just a brief comment on enforcing the democratic principles. It's not just Spain. It's for example France. You know, France is ruled by decrees in many areas. I don't know if that fits into the democratic principles. You know, the problem with Central and Eastern European countries is that they joined the EU largely because of the assumption that these are the new liberal democracies. That was our main and probably only negotiating strength. The EU did not need it. The enlargement for economic reasons. They could have offered us some kind of European Economic Area membership and exploit us economically without giving us a voice, to put it brutally. But we have joined, and the argument that, look, we have returned to democracy, we are the new liberal democracies, was one of our main arguments. And today we are losing that argument. That's the problem for us. And one short comment regarding the Stability and Growth Pact. Whenever you see rules not being respected, you always have two choices. First, strengthen the rules. Second, abandon the rules. There was always the second choice. Abandon the rules, let Greece go bankrupt within the Eurozone. Instead, Greece was told that you cannot do that. If you go bankrupt, we will cut your banking sector, and you will be forced to adopt drachma, basically. So I think that there was an alternative, and the alternative was abandoning the SGP, basically. You know, and last comment regarding the SGP. Remember, why was SGP introduced? SGP was introduced because Germany was afraid of inflation. Is this fear still valid? That was, in my opinion, one of the main reasons why there was a talk about SGP in 1990s in the post-Maastricht environment. And today we are enforcing the rules just because they are rules. That does not make sense.
I wanted to answer the question on local democracy and digital tools and the role of local governments, because that's in fact one of our core ideas and one of our core message in this party that we have founded, and we very actively promote the message that the first step towards more political awareness and activism starts at the local level. And if we look at, for instance, Latin America, we see that countries that are not as developed as the European countries have started with such tools and activities much earlier than Europe has. But of course, there are also good examples in Europe, for instance, Estonia. So I think that this is where we also have to start, and not only because it has proven successful in other countries, but also because local governments, municipalities, oftentimes are more open towards like 21st century tools and methods than the central government. At least that's my experience in Hungary and in other Eastern European countries. Yeah, and I wanted to mention that Hungary exited the Open Government Partnership, which demonstrates how open the central governments can sometimes be towards opening up. So yes, I completely agree with you, and we should exploit these tools much more than we do today.
Our time is running out, but I do want to give the floor back to the two gentlemen who wanted to raise questions. If we can have the mic over there.
Upraví mikrofon, děkuji, bylo to příjemné. Dobré odpoledne všem Evropankám, Evropanům. A otázka pro panelisty by byla jednoduchá. Ta první taková debata o tom, jaká je cílovost vlastně Evropské unie, trošku zapadla. Ať jednotlivé politické strany tedy na národní evropské úrovni řeknou, jestli jsou pro centrální byrokratický stát nebo superstát nebo říši bez demokracie, kde budou byrokraté prostě technokraticky rozhodovat, protože jsou moudřejší, mají víc informací a tak dále, až rozhodují, zažili jsme to v Sovětském svazu, ten se rozpad, dobře, tak si to zopakujeme. Nebo ať řeknou, chceme federaci, jako je Amerika, 2 senátory za každý stát. Mohli by být v Praze, máme krásný senát, náš pan prezident nabídl Prahu jako hlavní město Unie. Jeho rakouský kolega s tím souhlasil, když přijel vláčkem a říkal, ano, ať je Praha hlavní město Unie. Teď Brusel oficiálně není hlavní město. To je takový zvyk, kterýho se Brusel chytil. Nikomu se tam nelíbí, je to šedivé město, ošklivé. A Praha je krásná. Ale to je tak na okraj, takže jsou to určité cíle, které si můžeme stanovit a potom, ať rozhodne ten lid, jestli bude existovat evropský lid nebo lid v jednotlivých státech, který ten cíl si zvolí a ten demokraticky, který bude většinový, tak prostě bude fungovat. Protože jinak budeme takhle debatovat do aleluja, budeme všichni unavení a nikam se nedostaneme, protože prostě musí rozhodnout ten lid, necháme ho rozhodnout, jako v Katalánsku, nebo ho nenecháme rozhodnout a budeme říkat, ne, ty akademici, ty byrokraté, ti to vědí lépe než ten lid. Děkuji.
Mr. Onytskevich, the last question will be yours in this panel.
Well, in all basic documents of European Union, it is clearly written that every European country fulfilling certain criteria may join European Union. Now, it is European country. On that basis, Morocco trying once to join European Union was rejected right away. But if so, then the question is, what about Georgia? After all, we are talking about Georgian perspective of joining European Union. So either we should change the geography or we should change the bill, the basic documents of European Union. And the question, my question is this, going very far into the future, assuming that there is no more President Putin, Russia is a democratic country. Will Russia be actually eligible to join the European Union with all this tremendous demographic potential, which could change completely the very delicate balance which we have in the European Union? How would you respond to this question? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure Georgia joining the EU would enhance the chances of Prague becoming the capital of the European Union. But please respond to both those questions. I think both are really serious questions, and those will be also your short closing statements. So, do we want a superstate or not, and how about the future of the European enlargement?
Shall we start over here and move? Yeah, let's do that. If I may just take the privilege of starting then too. I will be very brief this time. On the first question, of course we all agree that the people should decide. The question is how the people should decide. And that is a very tricky question, and I think no one would object to the fact that people should be involved in the decision making. The question is how we arrange that. When it comes to future enlargements, Russia, this is of course a very good question. I can't really perceive that Russia would like to be included, but if we have Okay, if we would think very hypothetically, if we would think in terms of a more differentiated European Union, then of course why not being a part of a single market at one point in time? Why not? I mean, but definitely it's a very hypothetical question, and it's very much linked to what kind of how the Europe would look like. But definitely it would make it perhaps even more difficult to find a coherence. Thank you.
I think both questions refer to the finalité, one content-wise, the other more geographical. And as I argued before, I think this is not a good point of time to decide on these issues once and for all. I think we need some openness in this. And I think both questions, when it comes to geography, they are not on the table right now. Maybe we give an answer to this when the question is really imminent on the table. But of course, we certainly should strengthen those in Georgia. And in Russia as well, that would like to follow the European path and enact the European values.
Thank you. You have the last word as the person who brought forward the finality argument.
Yeah, my last word. As a federalist, I don't think we should go for some giant leap. Some of the problems we have been talking, or I have been talking about, as a practical solutions. And my final word would go back to what my colleague said. The biggest problem of the democracy in the EU is the non-existence of European parties, and one of the first steps we should take is to give them the opportunity to compete in EP elections. At the moment, they are banned from competing in EP elections, and even though the European parties propose Spitzenkandidaten, the problem is that they don't want to compete in the EU elections, and they are not allowed to compete in the elections. And this very much undermines the very idea of this political theater called Spitzenkandidaten and stuff like that. So political parties, European political parties, and let the people choose whether they want to vote for European political parties or national political parties. Let's have a fight.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a broad-ranging discussion. Very often when you hear these debates, you hear that Europe or the European elites are not responsive to the challenges. Well, I don't know if we're European elites, but you've certainly seen every panelist being very responsive to the challenges when it comes to both specific challenges or more ideological challenges. So we've definitely identified multiple challenges, as we should at this conference. I thank all the panelists for their participation. I thank for you the question and attention. I therefore close this session, but do stay with us after the coffee break. We will have the next session. Thank you so much.